The details of Formula One contracts are usually shrouded in secrecy, but sometimes scenarios surrounding contracts become so controversial or hilarious that they end up spilling into the public domain. For this video, we've dug out 10 interesting contract stories we think are worth another look. Which stories would make your list? Let us know in the comments. Remember to hit like on this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Damon Hill was a man in demand for 1998, holding talks with 5 teams in the summer of '97. McLaren offered him $1 million per race win but no basic retainer, which Hill took offence to, while Sauber were offering £1 million per race, an offer Arrows claimed it would match. Hill then upset Alain Prost by saying his team was too French, and when he told his former teammate he was signing for Jordan, Prost thought it was an underhand tactic to get a higher offer. But Hill's preference was always Jordan, even if negotiations for that deal were difficult and required some trickery to get the team's title sponsor on his side during the talks. This story has been attributed to various Ford bigwigs over the years, but regardless of who said the famous line, several key members of the Jaguar team, including Irvine, are convinced it's true. During a board meeting at Ford, the salaries of the highest earners in the company were being discussed, when someone asked, "Who is this Edmund Irvine we're paying millions of dollars to?" The story showed the total disconnect between the Ford Motor Company and the F1 team it was spending so much money on. When Nelson Piquet moved from Williams to Lotus for 1988, he was bound to have a much easier time alongside Satoru Nakajima than he had with Nigel Mansell. Piquet still had his #1 status written into his Lotus contract, and that included Nakajima having to agree to a code of practice that said he was expected to finish behind Piquet and that no passing manoeuvre will be attempted unless Piquet had an obvious mechanical problem and was clearly waving him through. And if you're interested, Piquet's basic salary was $1.5 million a year, with a bonus of $4,000 for every point he scored. Ferrari initially signed Fernando Alonso for 2011, but when it managed to bring that forward to 2010, it had to move Kimi Räikkönen aside despite the Finn having a contract. Räikkönen held talks with McLaren about a return there for 2010, but those ended when world champion Jenson Button unexpectedly became available. In the end, Räikkönen was paid not to race by Ferrari in 2010, instead taking up rallying for 2 eventful, incident-packed years before coming back to F1 with Lotus. To make the story even more remarkable, Ferrari then signed him back for 2014. Jean Alesi had a deal in place to drive for Williams for 1991, but then Nigel Mansell announced he was retiring, leaving Ferrari in need of a replacement. When Ferrari approached Alesi, he said he'd already signed for another team. However, in private, he was growing concerned about Williams delaying the announcement of their deal, and he eventually decided to sign for Ferrari. Williams managed to convince Mansell out of retirement instead, and it received compensation from Ferrari for Alesi, which included a 1990 car that had been driven by Alain Prost. Williams put the Ferrari on display in its museum before selling it in the early 2000s because it had become too much of a star attraction. That wasn't the only time Ferrari used one of its cars as a compensation gift. Mansell received one of his 1989 cars in exchange for accepting equal #1 status when Alain Prost joined the team. Jordan's first victory with Damon Hill at Spa was a cause for celebration for everyone except Ralf Schumacher. With a full wet setup, Ralf was clearly faster than Hill, but he was ordered to stay behind to ensure Jordan got a dream 1-2 finish. In the middle of the celebrations, Eddie Jordan was confronted by an angry Michael Schumacher, still fuming from his race-ending collision with David Coulthard that had handed Jordan the win in the first place. The older Schumacher told Jordan that Ralf would not be driving for him in 1999. Michael had already tried to talk Ralf into leaving for Williams, and the Spa situation was the final straw. Jordan had wanted to keep Ralf, but by this stage he knew his head had been turned, so he offered Michael a deal. If he was prepared to buy Ralf out of his contract, then he could leave for Williams. Michael paid up, which Jordan found particularly satisfying given how their previous interaction with each other had gone in 1991. But we'll come back to that one. Sauber signed Marcus Ericsson and Felipe Nasr for 2015, but its 2014 reserve driver Guido van der Garde arrived in Australia for the first race, claiming he also had a valid contract to drive for the team. Van der Garde said he'd signed the deal early in 2014 and his sponsors had paid the full amount in advance to help Sauber's finances. When Sauber initially announced Ericsson and Nasr, van der Garde took the matter to a Swiss tribunal which ruled in his favour. The Australian courts then upheld this decision and Sauber's attempted appeal was dismissed. Van der Garde then backed out of a move to have Sauber's assets seized and agreed not to take the matter any further over the Australian Grand Prix weekend. Sauber reached a settlement with van der Garde in the days after the race, which the Dutchman said was bizarre as the cash-strapped team had to pay significant compensation to him. Sauber said it had good answers to all the claims made by van der Garde, but it didn't want to get involved in a mud fight, leaving everyone wondering how a team run by a lawyer, Manisha Kaltenborn, had got into such a mess in the first place. Michael Schumacher's F1 debut for Jordan lasted only a few seconds, but after qualifying 7th at Spa, he'd made enough of an impact to instantly find himself at the centre of a contract storm. There are two versions of this story. One is that Schumacher's management carefully changed the wording of a letter it sent to Eddie Jordan promising to sign a contract rather than the contract that had been presented to them. This got Schumacher out of a long-term deal that was on the table with Jordan and allowed him to switch to Benetton for the next race at Monza. But Eddie Jordan believes the swap would have happened regardless, and he says it was all the work of Bernie Ecclestone, who realised how important it was for F1 in Germany to get Schumacher into a more competitive car. Schumacher's management was also aware that Jordan was switching to the unfancied Yamaha engine for 1992. Talks continued up to the last minute ahead of the Italian Grand Prix, with Jordan eventually helping ousted Benetton driver Roberto Moreno hold out for compensation, then taking most of that cash from the Brazilian to drive in the next two races. The Jenson Button Williams BAR contract saga ranks so highly on our list because it went on for so long, and during the course of it, Button changed his mind about which team he wanted to get out of driving for. Button was having the best season of his career with BAR in 2004 when he made the surprising decision to sign for Williams for the following year. BAR challenged that deal, claiming a loophole Button was trying to exploit in his existing contract was not valid. The Contract Recognition Board ruled in BAR's favour, but both Button and Williams said they would work together in the future. But a year later it became clear Williams was losing its Works BMW engines, and this time Button decided he'd be better off staying with BAR. Frank Williams was determined to hold him to the deal they'd signed for 2006, but eventually Button was able to pay a significant amount of money to get out of driving for the team he tried so hard to join 1 year earlier. When we were compiling this list, Ayrton Senna contract stories kept coming up. In the end we had so many we decided that rather than trying to slot them all in as individual entries, we'd just give him the number 1 slot and rattle through as many as we could. So here they are in chronological order. In 1984, Senna was benched for a race by Toleman because it was unhappy about the way he'd gone about engineering a move to Lotus for the following season. At Lotus, Senna vetoed Derek Warwick joining the team for 1986. Senna's view was that Lotus wasn't great at running two cars, so it shouldn't be trying to work for two equal status drivers. Warwick had already signed a contract with Lotus by this point, and while he accepts Senna was probably right, he was disappointed not to get the chance to race alongside him, and their careers went in very different directions after that. When Senna switched to McLaren for 1988, he and Ron Dennis were arguing over $500,000 in his contract. In the end they tossed a coin and Dennis won. Because the contract was for 3 years, $500,000 became a saving of $1.5 million, much to Ron's delight. At the end of 1989, following the controversial Japanese Grand Prix that handed Alain Prost the title, Senna briefly retired from F1, telling Dennis he wasn't coming back before being persuaded to keep racing. During 1992, aware that McLaren was falling behind Williams on track, Senna offered to drive for Williams for free. The only problem was that Williams had already signed Prost, and this time Senna was the one being vetoed. Senna had serious doubts about driving a Ford-powered McLaren for 1993, only agreeing to race for the team on the eve of the season, initially on a lucrative race-by-race deal that often involved him turning up at races at the last minute. Senna continued to push for a drive with Williams for 1994, and as more of the team's partners pressured Frank Williams to sign him, Prost decided to step aside, providing he was paid for the second year of his contract. The final twist in the tale came ahead of the final race of 1993, which Senna would go on to win for McLaren. Senna was having doubts about leaving, and he told Ron Dennis that if he'd known sooner that McLaren would have works Peugeot engines for 1994, he would have been prepared to stay. That's our list of crazy F1 contract stories. Let us know in the comments which ones were your favourites and any others that would have made your top 10. And remember to hit like on this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.